Ms. Wiseman, in your testimony, you highlighted several important challenges to managing federal records. Would you tell the committee just why it is so important to preserve these records appropriately? Perhaps you go a little bit more in depth from your opening comments. And more importantly, how does this benefit the American public? Why is this so essential?
These records are a critical part of our history, of our story. And they explain what the government has done and why it's done what it has done. Access to these records is absolutely critical for bodies like this committee and other committees in Congress and the public to hold our government actors accountable. And without records, that is simply not possible. They're also critical, as I've mentioned, for transparency laws like the Freedom of Information Act, which has as its backbone, if you will, records. I mean, records are the currency of democracy. They are the way we hold government actors accountable. And we have seen too many examples where, whether it's at NIH, whether it's at DHS, whether it's the Secret Service, we've seen too many examples where federal employees are either willfully or unwittingly avoiding or contravening their record-keeping responsibilities. And as a result, the historical record of what they're doing and why they're doing it is incomplete.
So why, in your opinion, Ms. Wiseman, is the Federal Records Act lacking? And specifically, as you know, we're drafting Strengthening Oversight of Federal Records Act. We've worked with you and have gotten your thoughts. But how do you think this bill, if passed, will address that problem, and why is it important for us to do that?
I think this bill has some really critical features that will address the problem. Number one, it requires as I understand it, it would require all departing employees to certify their compliance with the Federal Records Act. We've seen examples, I think, in the last administration, to very high-ranking acting level officials. It was discovered after they left that critical emails from a critical period had been deleted. If they had been required to certify upon leaving government that they had complied with their record-keeping responsibilities, that might not have happened, or there would have been some ability to hold them accountable for what they did. I think another provision that this committee is considering is to codify the capstone requirement. That's a program that NARA created that would require the email messages of a top level of agency officials at every agency to be preserved. And I think there has probably been inconsistent compliance with the capstone requirement. So I think this committee has the right idea to codify that requirement and extend it to all messages, including electronic messages. A huge problem has been the use by employees of either personal email accounts, personal phones, or ephemeral messaging apps, and these allow them to evade compliance with the Federal Records Act. This committee, I understand, is considering a provision that would ban that use unless they were backed up into a federal record-keeping system. And I think a big part of the problem, and I say this with a great deal of regret, is that the National Archives and Records Administration has simply not been willing or able to bring agencies into compliance with the law. I mentioned that they have a sort of tortured construction of the statutory provision that imposes on them a requirement to refer matters to the Department of Justice. And they are not well equipped. They don't have the investigative resources, for example, that the Department of Justice has, which is precisely why we think it's so critical that the obligation to make that referral be made clear. And again, my understanding is that the language that this committee is considering would do just that. So I think these are some of the provisions that would go a long way towards bringing a level of accountability that just isn't in the statute today.
Well, you mentioned in your testimony back in 2022, it was revealed that the Secret Service, along with the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Defense, had deleted text messages and other electronic records from their phones. With the reforms that you've just discussed and others in the bill specifically, would that prevent something like this from happening again in the future?
I believe it would. As I mentioned, those people, the departing employees would have had to certify, if the provisions of this bill were enacted, they would have had to certify that they complied with the law. And I think, in the face of that certification, I like to think that government actors, by and large, will do the right thing. The bill also, if Capstone were in place, it should have captured their emails as well. So that would have been another backup that, again, would have ensured that their emails were preserved. I think for the Secret Service employees, under the provisions of the bill this committee is considering, they would not have been able to use their phones, for example, or ephemeral messaging apps unless the agency had a system in place that automatically backed them up. So I do think that the provisions that this committee is considering could have made a real difference in very concrete ways.
So the Attorney General does have the ability to enforce, but it's simply not being used.
Yes.
Any
and-
suggestions of what we need to do?
Well, I think, again, I support what this committee is proposing, which is to clarify the language of the statute. I think it's Section 3106, that the archivist not only has the ability, but the responsibility to make a referral to the Attorney General when it comes to the archivist's attention that records are either being removed or destroyed. And we need to see NARA more robustly endorse that role. And once a referral is made, the Department of Justice does have the ability, better than NARA, to conduct an investigation. There are criminal penalties. There are other things that NARA can do. That the Attorney General, there's replevin. There are available enforcement tools, but they rest with the Attorney General. And we have to have a better mechanism to require NARA to bring attention to these problems. Because if NARA doesn't make a referral, how is the Attorney General supposed to know about a record-keeping violation?
Ms. Wiseman, after June of this year, NARA will no longer accept executive branch records in paper form. Could you explain the magnitude of this policy change and the challenges that it poses to NARA and, quite frankly, the rest of the executive branch?
Yes, I don't have precise numbers. I did read recently an estimate that as of a few years ago, on a daily basis, government employees sent or received over 1 billion emails. That's a day. And that's one form of record. Now, obviously, all emails are not going to qualify as records that need to be preserved, but I think it gives you a window into the magnitude of the problem, which really is enormous. NARA is going to be faced with ingesting billions and billions of records and put in digital and electronic form. And its job is going to be complicated by the fact that there are still some agencies who follow a print-to-paper practice, which means rather than storing their electronic messages, their emails electronically, they print them out and put them in a paper file. The technological capabilities of agencies differ widely. They don't all use the same technology. And the technology has, different capabilities at different agencies. Agencies historically have not worked, their record-keeping people don't cooperate and coordinate with the IT people. So typically at an agency, there's a real disconnect between the record-keeping people and the technology side of the agency, which is going to complicate NARA's job enormously. They just don't have a uniform way, agencies, of capturing and preserving these records. I think it's fair to say that without money and other resources, I don't see how NARA can perform this, statutorily prescribed job. It needs more people and it needs more money. And without that, I think it's probably doomed to fail because this is such an enormous undertaking.
So resources obviously always needed as you're dealing with the volume that you're speaking about, but you also need some technological advancements. Are there things out there that the government could be using that's available but we're not?
My understanding, and this is definitely not my area of expertise, is that AI, this is an area where AI may be of some assistance. I certainly think it's something that NARA should be studying and looking for ways to improve the way of ingesting and maintaining these records. I do think that agencies have to be brought into the 21st century with the framework they have for creating and preserving these records as well. And again, I know this is a difficult thing to tell Congress, but I think that also means more money for agencies to upgrade their technology.
Great, thank you. Mr. Askin, certainly you've spoken quite a bit about the importance of government transparency, and you brought up a number of issues related to FOIA, which I think is important. And in addition to having access to these records, which we obviously need, which is a serious issue that we want to address, it's still important to have good records management by the agencies. You got to start with good records management. Then you have the access to it, which is necessary for us to provide our oversight function. But talk about that. Why is a Records Act that modernizes and strengthens the keeping of these records, which is our attempt in this legislation we're proposing, why is that so important for FOIA? Why do we have to do that?
Well, it's so important.
Give me a mic.
It's, hello? Okay, yeah, it's so important because first, this is how we citizens hold our members of Congress accountable, is by, and our entire federal branch accountable, is by reading these documents, and our journalists read these documents, and that's how we know who's done well and who hasn't. Public trust in our government is in decline right now, and there's so much partisanship, and so the ability to keep federal records and to produce them when citizens want them and need them is crucial to public trust and crucial to increasing public trust at a time when our government is having troubles with trust. And so for these reasons, also historical reasons, we citizens ultimately in this country are in charge, and in order to be in charge, we need the documents that our federal government produces in order to make decisions about how we as a people will govern ourselves.